Trump clashes with Maine governor in the White House over transgender athletes. President Donald Trump engaged in a heated exchange with Maine's Democratic governor, Janet Mills, during a White House meeting on Friday regarding the administration's decision to withhold federal funding from the state over its policies on transgender athlete inclusion. The discussion, which quickly escalated into a tense confrontation, underscored the growing national debate surrounding transgender participation in sports and the broader implications of federal intervention in state-level decisions. During the meeting, which brought together governors from various states to discuss a range of policy issues, Mills directly challenged Trump on his stance, warning him that the state of Maine was prepared to fight the decision in court. "We'll see you in court," Mills stated firmly, making it clear that she intended to push back against what she viewed as an overreach by the federal government. Trump, unfazed by the warning, responded with characteristic confidence, telling Mills that he was looking forward to the legal battle. He went on to predict that her opposition to his order would spell the end of her political career, suggesting that she was out of touch with the views of many Americans on the issue of transgender athletes in women's sports. Following the exchange, the U.S. Department of Education announced that it was launching a formal investigation into the Maine Department of Education's policies regarding the inclusion of transgender athletes in school sports programs. According to a statement from the department, the inquiry would examine whether the state's policies were in violation of federal laws, including Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs. The confrontation between Mills and Trump came after a series of public criticisms between the two over the previous 24 hours. Trump had openly condemned Maine's policies, arguing that allowing transgender athletes to compete in women's sports created an unfair playing field. He framed the issue as one of protecting women's rights, claiming that biological males should not be permitted to compete against biological females in sports due to inherent physical differences. His comments were met with immediate backlash from LGBTQ+ advocacy groups and civil rights organizations, who accused the president of using transgender individuals as political scapegoats. Mills, for her part, defended Maine's approach, emphasizing that the state was committed to ensuring equal rights and opportunities for all students, regardless of gender identity. She accused Trump of using the issue as a means to rally his conservative base ahead of the upcoming election and argued that his administration was attempting to undermine state sovereignty by imposing federal restrictions on policies that should be decided at the state level. The clash in the White House's state dining room was notable not only for its intensity but also for the departure from the usually measured and diplomatic tone that tends to characterize interactions between state leaders and the president. While policy disagreements are common, particularly between leaders from opposing political parties, direct confrontations of this nature are rare in such formal settings. The broader debate over transgender athletes in sports has been a contentious issue across the country, with several states enacting laws or considering legislation that would restrict participation based on biological sex. Supporters of such measures argue that they are necessary to maintain fairness in competitive sports, while opponents contend that they are discriminatory and harmful to transgender youth. Legal experts predict that the battle over Maine's policies, and similar measures in other states, could ultimately reach the Supreme Court, setting a precedent for how transgender rights are handled in athletics nationwide. The outcome of such cases could have far-reaching implications for the interpretation of Title IX and the rights of transgender individuals in educational institutions. For now, the immediate fallout from the Trump-Mills confrontation remains to be seen. While Maine's governor has vowed to challenge the administration's actions in court, the Trump administration appears equally determined to push forward with its efforts to restrict federal funding for states that do not comply with its stance on transgender athletes. The situation is likely to fuel further political debate as the issue continues to polarize lawmakers, advocacy groups, and the public at large. As the legal battle looms, both sides are preparing for a long and potentially precedent-setting fight. The Trump administration has signaled that it will use every available legal avenue to uphold its policies, while Mills has gained support from civil rights organizations and Democratic lawmakers who view this as a fundamental issue of equality. Meanwhile, public opinion remains deeply divided, with passionate arguments from both supporters and opponents of transgender inclusion in sports. In the weeks following the White House meeting, protests erupted in several major cities, with both pro-transgender rights activists and groups advocating for restrictions taking to the streets to voice their positions. In Maine, rallies were held outside the state capitol, with supporters of Mills praising her defiance against federal intervention, while Trump supporters demanded the immediate withdrawal of transgender-inclusive policies. Political analysts suggest that this issue could become a defining factor in upcoming elections, as candidates from both parties have started addressing their stance on transgender participation in sports more explicitly. Republican lawmakers are pushing for federal legislation that would require athletes to compete based on their assigned sex at birth, while Democrats are working on measures to expand protections for transgender individuals in education and sports. Meanwhile, legal scholars are debating the potential ramifications of the Department of Education's investigation into Maine's policies. If the courts rule against the state, it could set a precedent allowing the federal government to enforce stricter regulations on transgender participation in sports nationwide. Conversely, a victory for Maine could reaffirm the rights of states to determine their own policies without federal interference. As these legal and political battles continue to unfold, media coverage of the issue has intensified, with major news outlets dedicating extensive segments to the ongoing controversy. Public figures, celebrities, and sports organizations have also weighed in, with some calling for inclusive policies and others insisting on maintaining traditional gender divisions in competitive sports. With no resolution in sight, the issue of transgender athlete inclusion is likely to remain a focal point of national discourse for the foreseeable future. The coming months will be crucial in determining the direction of policies at both the state and federal levels, as well as shaping the broader conversation on LGBTQ+ rights in America. Stay tuned as this story develops, and make sure to subscribe to Only Trump News for the latest updates on this and other breaking political stories.